salams and hello. First for the Kashmiri audiences, Mohtaram Nazreen, Assalamu alaikum. Umeed chu tuisu theek paitin, tuhund Ramzan tishu chalan theek. Yith kan zan tuh pai aswu ki yus ezuk son live session chu yus es poster mazan te os em bron te likhmut ki ezuk session chun Kashir mutlaq kihin. Belki ezuk session yus asis so as inshallah lazim Gaza mutlaq. Kyunki es chu pai weekend is Gaza mazan kum halat ch tait kan lukan sitin kya chu sabdan. तो सो छुन सिर्फ कशीर योती रिलेटेड की बल्कि यह पूरी इंसानियतुक मसले इसीलिए समझ अस कि माह रमजान छ सो वक्त यम सात अस अत पेटन यम सात अस अत पेट पज कत करें तो इसीलिए आज अत पेटन कत करान तो यम अस मेहमान अस सतन आज जुड़ित छ अत पेटन कत करने खतर तिम त छन कशीर कहीं तिहन जबान छन कशीर कहीं तो यम अत मजन मसाइल अस डिस्कस करो सु छन कशीरन रिलेटेड कहीं सु पूरी इंसानियतस रिलेटेड इसीलिए करो अस अंग्रेजीस मजन आज कत. And to the general audiences, hello, assalamu alaikum, and a very warm welcome. As you might already be aware that today we are talking about the crises, rather the multiple disasters that are unfolding in Gaza. I do not know if there is anything that I say as an introduction or any kind of new information that I give you as an opening that you don't know already. This is a crisis of the magnitude that hardly anyone in their sane mind would be unaware of. Genocide, ethnic cleansing, mass atrocities, crimes against humanities, a phase 5 famine, these were the kind of things that probably humans thought that these are things we would read in the history books. These are the things of the past. And in the current scenario, in the current international order, with international humanitarian law, with international norms, with the responsibility to protect on the international community, these are the kind of things that wouldn't happen. But yet, in the present times, what we are witnessing is until now about 32,512 people dead. Of them, about 1,300,000 are children. We are seeing what ICJ called was a plausible genocide. We are seeing ethnic cleansing. We are seeing mass atrocities. We are seeing crimes against humanity. According to United Nations, as per the international phase classification, there is a level phase or a phase 5 famine in Gaza, which means that people are starving to death. They are compelled to eat animal feed and grass to survive themselves, and they're not really sure where their next meal is coming from. About 25 children are already dead, and according to James Adler, who's the UNICEF spokesperson, uh, his visit to Gaza hospitals or these aid centers was that the children, the starving children, are paper thin. That is the kind of situation that we are unfolding. Not only that, then the public health emergency is the other thing. The water, the overall environment, and the kind of disaster that is unfolding through that is something that we can only pray that it doesn't happen that way. So I do not know what more to say about this, and I guess our experts who've joined us today are the right people to engage with on these issues and different perspectives that we'll try and tackle today. So joining us today are Dr. Muhammad Al-Ruzi, who's an academic at the University of Bristol. He works on childhood studies, and the focus of his research is the Palestinian children, and he happens to be from Palestine, rather from Gaza himself. And we have Hajar Naili, who's a media and communications expert who keeps a close eye on the conflicts and humanitarian disasters that are unfolding around us. So, Muhammad and Hajar, a very warm welcome, and thank you so very much for taking out time for today's session. And again, a very warm welcome to both of you. I realize, Mohammed, we are running out of time. You have to leave very early, isn't it? Not a spoiler, though. We've got quite a bit of time. So, I mean, the very first question that I wanted to pose to you is that, I mean, not a question, but just to set a larger context or background to the conversation that we are trying to have. I mean, with whatever's happening, we had a little bit of faith or hope that during Ramadan things would calm down a little bit because it's the holy month. But what we saw was massacre after massacre. Talk about the flower massacre, talk about the targeting of civilians that we saw yesterday, talk about the fire that happened in Al Shifa Hospital, and many more things that are unfolding around us. And also with the restriction of access that journalists can't access, and there is targeting of journalists. I mean, it's really hard to believe and also ascertain what really is happening because of multiple reasons that we'll tackle further, inshallah. Is would you like to run us through that, please? Yeah.
Thanks, Tausif, and thanks for the audience for joining us today. Today we're speaking about 170 days of relentless bombardment on the Gaza Strip. The assault in Gaza started before the 7th of October, as we all know, but the intensification of these processes were kind of taking place since 7th of October, resulting on unprecedented death toll, as you described. We're speaking about unprecedented number of journalists, local journalists. We're speaking about restrictions of international journalists to report from the field, and we are speaking about unprecedented number of children who have been killed. It has been described by Save the Children and UNICEF as something which they never seen in any other conflict, and it surpassed the number of the number of children who have been killed in the for the last 40 years in any other conflict around the world. So we are speaking about something of a big magnitude, and we are speaking about human suffering, which is exacerbated by this kind of like instrumental use of aid and using of starvation as one of the war weapons. Um, as you said, we're speaking about more than 32,000 people who have been killed since the 7th of October. And we're speaking about 44% of them are children. We're speaking about 28% of them are women. And with a complete silence from feminist organizations, with international organizations as well. For me, it was disappointing that all of this is happening. Disappointed the least, actually. Despite all of this happening, but still, we are marching in the day 170, still calling for a ceasefire, just to stop the hostilities and to engage in any kind of long-lasting kind of solution for this situation. It's worth to mention that since the ICJ ruling, we were anticipating that the number of the killing and the intensification of the killing would go a little bit lower. But from my analysis of the data, I can see like since the ICJ ruling, we're speaking about more than 6,000 people who have been killed. And again, with the beginning of the holy month of Ramadan, we were anticipating that things will change. But still, killing has been taking place almost on the same pace, leaving us all both angry but in shock about everything that is happening right now. I don't know what will happen next. Still, we are speaking about UN resolutions being violated. We are speaking about the Security Council failing to adopt and enforce a ceasefire, despite the ICJ ruling, which asked for some provisional measures. So it's a dark time, and unfortunately, and still the events are unfolding before our eyes, and we don't know how this will lead and where it will lead in the near future.
Absolutely, Muhammad. It's so surprising that, I mean, the other day I was actually shocked. I was listening to Mustafa Barghouti, and who was actually comparing the proportions, that when he said the number of people who were impacted in Gaza, and if you compare that to the percentage, he said that it's 4.5%. And in the US terms, if such a thing was unfolding in a place as big and as populous like the US, it would mean 12 million people. So that might give people a little bit of an idea of how massive, in terms of proportion, in terms of the percentage of impact, this situation is. Then when you talk about the kind of like crises that is unfolding, I mean, there is responsibility to protect, which actually makes it quite pertinent for the international community. If there is like a genocide, if there are war crimes, if there are crimes against humanity, if there are crimes like collective punishment and ethnic cleansing unfolding on people, it makes it pertinent to for the international community to play their role and ensure peace and ensure safety and protection for these people. even if they have to go against these very states and take appropriate, plausible measures under maybe Chapter 6, Chapter 8, however that be. But unfortunately, these are the kind of crises, disasters, and I mean, brazen violations of international law, international humanitarian law, and we still see that there's nothing happening. But what's more pertinent to me, and that's what I want to ask Hajar. Hajar, I mean, you deal with media, you keep a very close eye on that, and what we've seen is that uh, I mean, the kind of narratives that come in the mainstream Western media are quite sort of like, if not twisted, but at least restricted, limited to a particular version. So much so that Mehdi Hassan had to be kicked out after his interview because maybe he crossed certain red lines. We'd go into the proper sort of like unpacking of those things and their impact a bit later as well. But what I wanted to ask you was that, do you think this is also actually escalating the massacres or the tragedies and the disasters that are unfolding in Gaza? Because, the media is not reporting them the way it should. It's not creating, or it's not actually maybe priming the nation states to work and act in certain or particular ways, because it's manufacturing a way of consent in a way. What do you have to say about that?
Thank you, Tosef, for the invitation, and salam alaikum to your audience. To your question, I cannot say with certainty that the coverage of mainstream media has contributed to the escalation of killings of civilians. However, we have witnessed a media coverage that has contributed to dehumanize Palestinians, and therefore to help justify that what Israel is doing, after all, might not be so bad. So it's important to note that the media in any war, in any armed conflict, play a big part in what we call the winning hearts, winning minds approach, in this case orchestrated by Israel to appeal to general audience, large audiences, in order to secure their support for what they're doing today in Gaza. Now, if I cannot say with certainty that the mainstream media coverage has aided the escalation of killings, we have seen, especially in the first few months of the war, that most mainstream media, top-tier media, relied primarily and heavily on Israel's information and narrative, leading to an incredibly biased news coverage and the spread of unverified and false information that, again, may have in turn give the impression to audiences that what Israel is doing is justified. I want to say that more recently, as the crimes and the violations committed by Israel have become too hard to defend, too hard to explain, too hard to justify, newsrooms seem to have recalibrated their news coverage and probably distanced themselves a little bit more from the narrative promoted by Israel. And the bias of several mainstream media, again, in the Western world has been heavily criticized. Their own ethics was questioned by audiences around the world, online, and including by professionals in their newsrooms. Some have resigned. Some have even exposed the biases within their own newsrooms. And you did mention the example of Mehdi Hassan. With this question, I also want to mention the journalists in Gaza. You have mentioned, I think, in your first question, journalists being targeted. Journalists in Gaza have done a remarkable work of coverage and documentation. I want to just mention here that this work is not only for news purpose. What they're doing can be used in a court of justice to hold accountable Israel for their crimes. So if we might not see the result right away, hopefully one day it will lead to some form of justice. Now, journalists, you did mention, have paid a heavy price in Gaza. The last number, I think last week, was 125 journalists killed since October 7th. It's safe to say that this is probably the deadliest war for reporters in decades. And I want to finish by mentioning a point I think that you also quickly raised in your question, Tosef, in the first question, that almost 6 months into this war in Gaza, Israel has not allowed foreign journalists in the Gaza Strip outside of the rare and escorted trips with the Israeli military, very controlled trips, and controlling also the narrative and what journalists can say and what they will broadcast. So if I'm not mistaken, having not allowing and not having foreign journalists covering a war for such extended period of time, the entirety of the war, is something that we have never seen anywhere else. It's unprecedented. So it's unusual. And I have to say that also journalists from these mainstream newsrooms are extremely frustrated and have been calling on Israel to allow them, to give them access. So with foreign journalists out of Gaza, all the information about Gaza is essentially coming from either the Palestinian side, the Palestinian journalists, or the Israeli authorities. And we've seen over and over again how it's easier for Israel to question and undermine the credibility and news stories and videos and footage shared by Palestinian journalists in Gaza than by journalists from CNN, BBCs, and the like. So hence also why foreign journalists from mainstream media have not been allowed into Gaza until now.
Thank you, Hajar. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's shocking but not surprising, because there is a manufacturing of consent that has to happen, and there is a way the lobbies are playing in, from media to the parliaments to the nation state actors at the same time. So I mean, thank you for running us through that. Mohammed, I mean, I want to touch on a similar kind of an issue again, is that the way things are happening, the media is made to believe in certain narratives, made to propagate certain narratives. The nation states are made to process or take certain informations and have certain kinds of stands. I mean, you've been quite active with these popular protests. I mean, we've witnessed quite a bit since October 7 over here. And this is also true that over time, the numbers that we saw has been coming down, not a steady decline, but at times there is a 50% decline, for instance, the kind of protest that we saw in the past weeks, that not the main protests that happened in London, but in the cities, etc. Because what's happened is that there have been persistent since October, persistent popular demands, popular protests. And what on the other hand has happened is that they seem to have fallen on deaf ears. The governments have not heard anything. The governments haven't reacted in the way the people demand things or ask them to make a stand. In fact, you have a very recent experience of the same kind, where you were told more of a if not a lie, but a misinformation about a statement in the council where you presented the case. So the thing is that, do you think that the government's actually being adamant on the kind of stand that they take and not listening to the popular protest, it has also impacted the resilience of the people, the popular protest, and created a little bit of this underconfidence, if not hopelessness?
Thanks, Tausif. This is a good question. And I think for me, it was shocking that we had to demonstrate for all of these weeks. I mean, every week, either we demonstrate in London or in Bath and Bristol, in the kind of cities around. There has been a big number of people who have been marching constantly, joining different kind of actions in a form of protest or occupying public spaces and trying to make their voice heard. It was disappointing that politicians didn't give enough attention to these kind of protests, which expose basically the very basic of democracy. I mean, you have these kind of demonstrations that has been taking place for a long time, trying to practice pressure, and they are like the most peaceful and the most diverse kind of demonstrations, and then yet you have this kind of public statements coming from the government trying to criminalize or stigmatize these kind of protests and making them look like as if they are dangerous to democracy, although they are like the very obvious kind of presentation of democracy. I mean, we have to keep this kind of voice alive. And I've seen many instances, also in reference to what Hajar just said, of Western media not covering these kind of protests. So basically pretending as all of these thousands and hundreds of thousands actually protesters, they do not even exist. And every time I join one of these demonstrations, I check on the BBC and other channels and see if it has been reported, and there's nothing. So basically, in the public sphere, the main narrative is that everyone is fine with what is happening and there's not enough disagreement. At best, they would demonstrate, they will put the whole issue as something which is controversial. There are some people from both sides calling for a ceasefire or a continuation of hostilities, watering it down, making it like as if it's like, okay, it's another kind of debatable issue rather than reflecting the voices of those people. Recently, I was giving a statement in the council of the city where I live, and everything that has been going on there, it was about like really questioning our statements, questioning the magnitude of what we're doing, and trying to water down what we are trying to call for. We wanted a firm call for a ceasefire, not just a statement that we would support a ceasefire, for example. And this has basically make citizens in the country where I live, but also citizens around the world, feel disappointed and feel a bit demoralized, alienated, feeling that, okay, we cannot do much. We've exhausted our resources, our capacity, our time. Going every week, it doesn't work. We have to try something else. And this is in itself is dangerous. I feel the same kind of disappointment, but nonetheless, I feel the importance of continuing to put pressure, even if it takes longer. But I think this is a democratic avenue that we have, and we should exploit and we should use as much as we can. Um, of course, it exposes the limitation of democracy. It exposes the international kind of order of human rights. But I think nonetheless, we need to remind those politicians at different levels, at the level of the parliament, council, municipalities, everywhere, that they should be held accountable and what they are doing is wrong, and they are chosen to be on the wrong side of history. And I think they should be reminded all the time and be shamed as much as we can, so that we can hold them accountable at some point.
Absolutely, Muhammad. I mean, I totally echo you on these thoughts. There definitely is a bit of demoralization of certain people. I mean, last week in the protest that I went to, there were people who said that ultimately, like, nothing's happening. It's so distressing. But the kind of answer that I had to give to them was that ultimately, even if we are not able to push the governments or like prime them to take a pro justice stand or be on the right side, but at least this is a conscientious decision that you're doing for your own self, at least, that rather than being a mute spectator to something, you're at least in a position to answer your own self that you're doing something in this regard. You're doing your little bit, even if that's not changing anything, but you still are able to sleep in the way that, okay, you're not complicit by being a mute spectator. Because I remember one of the posters that came up last week was, silence is complicity, or silence is criminal, or silence is violence. So we are not being silent. We're at least doing our little bit, maybe demonstrating, gathering together, again, calling on our governments to actually heed to the calls of the people and heed to humanity. And let's hope that that kind of change comes through. But I definitely echo your thoughts on this a little bit of disheartening or demoralization. And I wouldn't go to a different question. I wouldn't digress, but I would like Hajar to actually build up on this. I mean, when we talk about the global north, or in the common parlance, the West, liberal democratic ideals, the right to protest, the freedom of the individual, the freedom of expression is something which is epitomized as the sum total of what being a democracy seems like. But over time, what has also happened is that there's been more of how Muhammad was saying, criminalization of these popular protests. They've been peaceful, they've been quite organized, there are no incidents, but they've made out to be like criminals, where like even the leaders of the countries have actually sort of like criminalized these protests and protesters and criminalized even protesting. There are now laws that are being thought of to scuttle these kinds of popular associations. And it's not only for Palestine, but the very spirit of democracy is alive, and there is a right to dissent among the people, a collective gathering, forming opinions, protesting, associating, demonstrating. And when you are taking away those things, that it goes against the very vein or the very essence of being a democracy, or even if you talk about the idea or whatever term you call it, the liberal democracy, whatever that means. So do you think it's exposing the reality of these democracies or democratic setups?
Mhm. So I will start by saying, when it comes to the Middle East and North Africa, where we know marches and gathering and protests have been restricted and even banned, protests in these region of the world have been silenced by government, because most of them are primarily afraid that the growing pro-Palestinian solidarity movements could fuel social changes and political changes at the domestic level. So there is more fear and a concern about the leaders of these countries about themselves. However, when it comes to countries in the global north, you mentioned the United Kingdoms, the US, the Netherlands, France, and so on and forth, the restrictions here are an attempt to silence the voices in support of justice and Palestinians, and also, again, to control the narrative. When people take to the streets to call for a ceasefire, while our governments are still reluctant to call for one, they don't even want to even say the mention the name ceasefire. That shows that we have an issue of political representation, with elected officials not aligning anymore with the demands of the thousands, the several thousands of people who are on the streets. The protests also have caused huge damage for the image of these governments, of which most of them have close ties with Israel, including through military corporations, and that's the case of the United Kingdoms and the US, the Netherlands, and other countries. So these protests are exposing the complicity of in atrocity and horrors committed by Israel in Gaza of our governments. And this is also damaging their credibility as so-called bearer of human rights and democratic values. So here, the masks are off, if I may say. You did, I think, hinted at it in your question, Tusef. Historically, also, we know that governments across the world have used moments of crises to launch attacks on civil liberties, often starting with those who are already marginalized: Black, brown people, Muslim people. And it happened in the aftermath of 9/11. It happened in the aftermath of the bombing of July 7 in the UK, and even during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it just happened again in the UK, where the government unveiled a new definition of extremism. Some experts are already saying that the new definition is an attempt to subjugate and marginalize British Muslims or Muslims in the UK who are taking a stance against the war on Gaza. So, in a nutshell, we live in democracies called democracies that pick and choose which people should be given their rights, and when they should be given their rights, and what for they should be given their rights, because our rights and freedoms are perceived as a threat to their personal and political interests, and that is definitely a dangerous path that we are currently walking on.
If I may add here something, I think
Totally.
I totally agree with you, Haja, and I think the issue here is not about just silence or trying to silence kind of protests, but it's also about taking active actions against undermining the work of those protesters. For example, we have a few weeks ago, we have the bill in the parliament, which was about criminalizing boycotting entities, trying
Yeah.
to prevent public bodies, municipalities, and governmental entities in the UK to boycott and sanction Israeli goods and actions. Although the government itself, have strong evidence about Israel committing war crimes in Gaza, and despite that, continuing to supply Israel with weapons and everything. So it's not about just staying neutral, but it's about being also complicit and taking action, which exacerbate and increase the devastation of the suffering of the people in Gaza. And I think what you've mentioned about using these kind of moments for, I totally agree with that. I mean, they're using these kind of moments to restrict a kind of democratic avenues that are left for the population. And it's dangerous for everyone, even for those who have nothing to do with Palestine, who don't have even any empathy or any connection with the Palestinians. I think it increase and intensify the processes of othering. So creating this kind of like division about against migrants, xenophobia, about different kind of minorities, using the same kind of laws and regulations. Because once we agreed that being anti-Palestinian is something to be tolerated in the public sphere, then we can extend this to anti-different groups, anti any minority that we can think of. So it's really dangerous what is happening right now, and I think we need to continue this kind of fight for freedom of everyone. I think it's not only about
Absolutely.
in relation to the
Absolutely.
situation in Gaza.
Totally. I mean, what I see is more of like, if I sum it up, is an inversion of democracy that's happening. And it would have implications not only for the protests that are happening in support of Palestine, but at the same time, we know the kind of protests that are happening for traders' rights, for employment rights. Like each and every community, each and every sector is actually protesting the kind of things that are happening to them, or the kind of service rules or the codes under which they have to serve. And it would actually criminalize all of those, the very working class that keeps the countries running, which is actually unbecoming of a democracy and inversion of democracy, rather. Before I move on to the second thing, here is a little bit of an information to the audiences that have joined us on Instagram. As expected, we are very sorry your comments are not able to fetch to us on our dashboard. And if at all our voices are reaching out to you, we are really sorry we are not able to highlight those things due to certain technical errors. There are certain glitches uh, which we expected would happen. So if you wish to that your questions be highlighted and reach us, please see if you can write those comments or your questions on YouTube or Facebook. But we are not sure that there as well. But let's hope for the best. Mohammed, coming on to this, what we also see is the kind of thing that it tells us is about the brazen double standards. I remember a video of Anthony Blinken last year when the Ukraine-Russia war erupted, and it was a statement where he even cried that children were being killed, and like just on the plight of children, and it wasn't as many, 13,000 children. And when we say children, it's 3, 4, 5 years old in Gaza. And the statement was that the bombing of the schools, the bombing of hospitals, the targeting of children can't be our new normal, and it can't be tolerated. So that was when it came to the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which is condemnable, which is absolutely horrible, and nobody supports that. But what happens when it comes to Gaza or Palestine or maybe similar kinds of protests? Do you simply, how do we make sense of these double standards that we are seeing right in front of our bare eyes? to one conflict or one situation, there is this like you're upholding the torch of humanity, you're becoming, in Najo's words, the bearers of humanity. But when it comes to some other situations, for instance, the one that is unfolding in front of our eyes, it doesn't really matter. So how do we make sense of these double standards?
I think I'm still trying to process this kind of double standards that are happening. I wouldn't say that I am completely shocked by what happened and what is happening. I grew up with this kind of idea that human rights are not applied in a consistent way across the different conflicts, and the human rights discourse itself has been instrumentally used either to give kind of legitimacy or to take legitimacy from different kind of political arrangements. And we've seen it in different kind of conflicts. I would like to think about, like, to remind the audience about what happened in the Iraq War. More than 1 million people have been killed, despite the protests. It was one of the biggest demonstrations that were taking place in London, for example, but yet the UK and the US engaged in this kind of war, resulting in a lot of devastation against the Iraqi people. And we've seen many different examples. This is not like the first time that we see this kind of double standards. But to see this kind of like clear and high contrast between two conflicts that have, in a way, kind of similar dynamics, one occupying power, taking over another territory, and the indigenous population trying to resist, and how much those are seen as heroes, but others are seen as criminal and terrorists. The whole discourse has been really quite revealing about this double standards, and it exposed the extent to which this discourse of human rights have been instrumentally used by governments themselves. Like we can use the killing of children in some contexts as a way to say, like, we need to take action. There's an urgency to put sanctions. We have to save the people who are under the fire, while at the same time, under this kind of dehumanizing language, we do not grant the same kind of entitlement to other people and groups. And we've seen it very strongly in the case of Ukraine and in the case of Palestine and what is happening right now. For example, in the context of Ukraine, we've seen the ICC, International Criminal Court, taking actions just in the first few weeks of freezing assets and confiscating assets which are related to those involved in the Ukrainian war, Russians. And we've seen it also with big corporations withdrawing their businesses. We've seen it with even international monetary transactions and financial kind of transactions being blocked. So this kind of isolation, which has been practiced against Russia, we haven't seen it in the case of Palestine, but also we've seen it in other, let's say, in other occasions where the humanitarian logic should prevail. For example, allowing a safe passage for Ukrainians who wish to leave, to settle, and to start fresh, or at least to have a pause of this kind of conflict. But we haven't seen it up until now. Palestinians who are living in the UK and also in other countries in Europe, for example, have been calling for any form of even temporary family unification with their families. And all of these requests have been denied. Sometimes it's about saying that, okay, but you are not a national, or giving kind of vague excuses for why this is difficult, or using bureaucracy for making these processes really, really difficult. So it's a clear example of structural racism. To be honest, I'm not very much surprised about what's happening. It's But I mean, to have these kind of two events happening around the same time, feel like, wow, okay, this is another level of using double standards and not being consistent in applying international law and humanitarian law as well.
Thank you,
If
Mohammed.
I
Yeah,
can add very
yeah,
quickly to what
yeah.
Mohammed said, and I fully agree with his analysis here. There is definitely this perception that the Ukrainian people look like us, so we are safe if we take them with us at home, versus people coming from the Middle East and Arab countries and Muslim countries, because we have been dehumanized, we have been vilified for so many years. I would say for 20 plus years, since 9/11, especially. So there is that framing also. And the second aspect also of this double standard, again, it's self it's it's about countries looking at their self-interest, the geopolitical dynamics. That we're talking about Russia. Russia is perceived not as an ally, but as enemy of most Western countries. So it was convenient for them to go and sanction Russia, to go and condemn Russia. It was easy. They didn't need to send an investigator in Ukraine to tell us that this airstrikes was illegal. When you ask them the same question about Israel, they tell you, oh, they are not legal experts anymore. So again, yes, this double standard, because it's convenient. We are talking about Russia versus Israel, which is an ally of most of Western countries.
Absolutely agree
And if
with
I
you.
may add just one thing, I
Yeah,
think the second aspect and the second factor of geopolitical interest is, in my opinion, is the most dominant one. It's not about the color, although sometimes the color of the eyes is used as a cover to say like they look similar to us. But I think even Ukrainian and people from Eastern Europe have went through these processes of othering. They are seen as sometimes as less in Western Europe communities and societies and politics. We've seen, for example, just a few years ago, we have the Brexit,
absolutely. Yeah.
which discriminated against actually also other European, even from Western Europe.
The Eastern Europeans, more particularly, they're taking our
Exactly.
jobs from Romania, Poland, and other places.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. So it's like this makes me feel like, okay, this is kind of at the core of it is there's geopolitics and there's this kind of like they are trying to say welcome to Europe to Ukrainians, um, and all of this just to make the war last longer, and hopefully that they can defeat like their enemy basically.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I like the usage of your word structural racism, but that's so emphatic and so, I mean, it's so riveting. There's so much to think about those things that actually, what popped in my head that time was the journalist, white journalist in Ukraine, when the crisis actually unfolded in there, saying that this is the civilized world, it can't happen there. I'm just trying to
Mm.
paraphrase. I remember that went viral, isn't it? So that also becomes quite telling about the kind of racisms and double standards, because it's people ultimately, the kind of ideologies who become actors in these nation states and others, and that's how they run things over there. That's one way of looking at these things. And also then, what Hajar actually talked about, the geopolitics. Ultimately, what actually reinforces your hegemony, then that's a good thing. There, the rights, other things like protection of humanity, bringing liberation to women in Afghanistan, weapons of mass destruction and other things. So you will work upon. You won't even wait for the United Nations to actually give you an approval, because it concerns humanity. But at the same time, if it actually doesn't reinforce the hegemony that you're trying to animate in the entirety on the globe, then oh yeah, you just have an ostrich behavior towards that, as if nothing's happening. What that actually swerves me towards is Hajar. I mean, as I said in the beginning, in the opening, that there are so many crises, disasters, and crimes unfolding simultaneously. And it's not me or us saying, it's the organizations from United Nations to WHO to Medicine Sans Frontières to other important organizations calling, even including the ICJ, ICC. That means genocide collective punishment, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, uh, uh, genocide in terms of like the phase 5 famines as per the international phase classification. It's not that somebody would arbitrarily say just because people are hungry they're dying and that's famine. No, there is a very meticulous, scientific, quite detailed process that the international organizations use as per the international phase classification. So it's scientific, very very accurate, and phase 5 is the highest level it can go to. What I mean, ultimately, crimes like these in in the World UN Summit in 2001, every country unanimously actually approved this responsibility to protect. If there are crimes like these, if there is just one crime like this, not a collectivity of these crimes, it is imperative on the world community to come to the protection of these people, take appropriate measures, maybe diplomacy, maybe pressure, maybe sanctions, or even military action under Chapter 7. But I mean, I don't even need to say. We are seeing these things unfold right in front of our eyes. We are watching a genocide. We are watching collective punishment. We are watching ethnic cleansing. We are watching crimes against humanity. We are watching mass atrocities. We are watching a phase 5 famine unfold right in front of our eyes. And nobody is unaware of that. And still, we see no action. There's an inertia for international players to even act upon those things. Do you think that it actually bursts, rather, it punctures the very bubble of something called international order, international humanitarian law, international norms? I mean, how do you even believe about those things?
There is a lot to unpack here, but there has been a blatant failure to protect on part of the international community, without a doubt. The international community, or I should say, some members of the international community, have undermined the exact same tool that they have been calling for, that they have created, that they have supported the creation of these tools and instruments, because today it's no longer convenient. Because today, if they are using this tool, they will need to use these tools against everyone. And this is the purpose of these tools. They need to apply the principle of universality, and that means against their friends. If their friends commits atrocities and crimes, they need to use and employ these tools against their friends. But this is when they're not ready. They're not ready to abide by the commitments they made. So there has been a blatant failure to protect. Let's start with the occupying power, Israel. Israel, as the occupying power, should protect the population under its authority. However, in this case, the occupying powers is also the one committing the atrocities in contravention of all international norms, instruments, and treaties with blatant impunity. Ironically, and I just said it, that many of Israel's friends, the US, the UK, France, and the others, have been fervent supporter of the responsibility to protect doctrine, which was you did give a bit of history, Tusif, which was created after the genocide and the atrocities in Rwanda and Yugoslavia. So the aim was to never again repeat what happened in the 90s. But we are seeing this again unfolding under our very eyes in Gaza. So the friends of Israel, the US, the UK, and the others, have also failed to intervene to stop these atrocities under the responsibility to protect doctrine. Once again, we don't know what might happen in the coming weeks if they will decide to go towards that road. Coming back to the US also, we should mention that the US, again, has introduced itself as a beacon of democracy, of human rights, of justice. But the US provides several billions of dollars in weapons to Israel, and has done nothing also to stop the killing of civilians. Instead, it has kept shipping weapons to Israel. So has the US failed in its responsibility to protect? It is safe to say yes, they have certainly failed in that responsibility. A little more on the question you asked, Tusif, the diplomatic complicity in the killing of more than 32,000 people today in Gaza and the man-made humanitarian crisis in Gaza are the culmination of years of erosion of the international rule of law and the systems of global human rights, which began I want to say, about 20 years ago with the war on terror under the US leadership in response to 9/11. So what we see today, it's not new. It is just the climax of what we've seen unfolding over the last 20 years. And again, the never again principle was thrown away on October 7 when Israel launched its military campaign against Gaza. And since then, the unpermissible became permissible. For weeks and months, and until today, some countries have done nothing to stop the mass killing of civilians in Gaza under the pretense that Israel has the right to defend itself against the same people that it has also a duty to protect as the occupying power. I hope your audiences see the contradiction here and that there is something wrong, obviously wrong. The massive toll on civilians in Gaza committed in the name of self-defense and countering terrorism is also in line against this concept ignited by the war on terror, that using unrestricted and unchecked violence is permissible as long as we are going after the bad guys, the terrorists. And we know the narrative that has been played for Gaza. The terrorists are everywhere in Gaza, according to Israel and their supporters, and that goes again against the international law system and the principle of universality, that we still need to protect the people regardless on which side of the front line they find themselves. I just want to add a final point, because again, there is so much to say about this question of the undermining of the international law system. And it's again, the failure to protect of the US, and not only the failure to protect, but its complicity. The US is, we have to admit, it is such a huge and big actor on the international stage. So whatever the US say, a lot of people will listen to whatever the US say, will look at the US, will wait to see how the US acts and responds. So the US has an incredible responsibility. And the US for weeks and until now still downplays the relentless bombing and the devastating siege in Gaza and the loss of civilian lives. It has, the US, as some other countries have, and the media as well, and Israel, have focused their narrative essentially on Hamas actions instead of acknowledging the context of what is happening, that things did not start on October 7th, that there is a continuity. And instead of looking at the big picture, they have isolated their response to what happened since October 7 to justify the actions of Israel. And as a result also, and it has been a tradition, it's not even as a result, it's been a tradition, there have been multiple resolutions vetoed by the UN, by the United States at the UN Security Council. The last one was actually introduced by the US, but vetoed by the others. But this is for another.
Absolutely. There's quite a bit of thought in that as well. And I liked, probably, was it Guyana who,
Yes,
the representative who actually explained it so emphatically why they wouldn't support it, because it was nothing. It was more of an eyewash. And I mean, I want to build upon this point where you're talking about the media. That takes me to the second thing that was on top of my head. The kind of propagations, the kind of propagandas that have come through to support these claims and to kind of like justify what they're doing, this right of defense narrative, there has to be a little bit of homework also to be done, that you would propagate to the people, that we've seen unfold in the media, where particular kind of narratives get the voice. In the words of Judith Butler, there's only one kind of violence that is seen, and we know what violence that is. And then, for instance, the 40 beheaded babies or the rape of women. I was watching the documentary by Richard Sanders on October 7th that aired on Al Jazeera as well, where they're busting these claims. The New York Post article was actually busted that by Jeffrey Gettleman and Anna Schwartz and her nephew, probably. And each and every bit of that claim has been busted to smithereens, even like 40 beheaded babies. And those were the kind of foundations that actually sort of gave them the justification. Now it's their responsibility to protect. And as someone else also, I don't remember his name, said, that gave them hell. And that's what they actually did. And I mean, would you like to talk more about this kind of the propaganda, because you are a media expert, and the way these things work and the way these things then sort of like unfold or manifest the way we are seeing it in Gaza?
A lot to unpack here again. I will start by saying that the job of journalists is to present factual information as clearly as they can, to seek diverse sources, which was not very well done for the coverage of the media of the war in Gaza, to have vigorous verification procedures. That's also something a lot of mainstream newsrooms have failed, or at least from the outside, that's the impression they gave us, and to make sure that they do their job in a just, equitable, and fair manner. Unfortunately, here again, we've seen a lot of biases in the media, in the news coverage of the war in Gaza. And I did say earlier, most of mainstream media have relied heavily and primarily on the Israeli narrative and Israeli information, unsubstantiated claims from Israel, unverified. They run with it. They did not verify, which I would suspect if it was the other side, they would have waited before broadcasting the information to seek diverse sources and to confirm the information before airing it. Now, I want to say that disinformation and misinformation is widespread in almost every armed conflict and war. The war in Gaza, it's not an exception. However, what's unusual for the war in Gaza is that what we have called reputable media have contributed to the spread of false information by relaying unverified and unsubstantiated claims, primarily by Israeli officials, but also by other officials, like the US president made a lot of several false statements. And most mainstream media, again, have considered Israel as a credible source that cannot be challenged, that cannot be questioned. And I want to say that was essentially the case in the first few months of the war. And as things became worse, and they were, and the most of mainstream media became under scrutiny, their stories became under scrutiny and criticized for the lack of diverse sources, for the biases, for the lack of verification, but also from inside of their newsrooms, they became criticized. So the coverage slightly tried to be more balanced, but again, we're not there yet. What we have seen also in the case of the war in Gaza, and that happens frequently actually when there is a war in conflict, it's reactivity. The news is reacting to the horrific acts of violence. And here it was primarily October 7, what the people endured on October 7 as a result of the attack of Hamas. And what the journalists are not doing well enough is to provide context. Of course, they might seem boring to give a history lesson, but in that case, because people's lives are at stake, it is critical. And there are creative ways to provide context and to make sure that people get the full picture in order to be, again, just, equitable, and fair in their coverage. Another point that I want to mention when we speak of the media coverage, and I think I hinted at it a bit earlier, is when there is a conflict with Muslims or Islam, it's often portrayed as the good versus evil. And the evil here in that case are the brown, the black people, the Muslim people. That's the evil side. So the war against Gaza and against Palestine is in line with this framing that we can trace back to 9/11, when the President George W. Bush said, "You are with or against us. We are here again in that same framing. So that's no surprise also that we have witnessed a rise in Islamophobia in our streets here in European cities and North American countries, with a rise of attacks against Muslims since October 7. Um, I would say once again, the leadership in this since October 7, the leadership came from the streets. We talked about protests earlier. And when it comes to the media and holding the media to account, it also came from the people online, on social media, other journalists verifying the sources, unveiling and uncovering the biases of publications, as you mentioned, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. But again, even though there has been a biased coverage, the social media, despite all the negatives that we can say about social media, the fact that journalists in Gaza were able to feed our timelines, our time feeds, sorry, with images coming from Gaza, it became too hard to look the other way, to say no, this is not true, no, this is not happening. So again, the journalists in Gaza, the citizen journalists, have done an incredible work to also counter that narrative. So we often talk about the mainstream media providing a misinformed coverage, but I don't think we talk too enough of the journalists in Gaza that have done also an incredible work to push back.
Totally. And at the same time, I mean,
Can I,
what
can I
comes to
just
mind? Yes, yes, please go
sorry,
ahead.
just I want
Yeah,
to add, like, those journalists are doing this incredible job under this kind of constant bombardment, but this is not only the circumstances that they are working under. It's important to mention that those journalists receive regular calls from the Israeli intel, intimidating them and asking them that they are putting their lives at risk, but also threatening them that they will kill their family members.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like something which has been reported by many journalists. And despite that, they feel like, okay, they're gonna be like the martyrs of truth, and they're gonna tell their stories, despite the implications, which can be basically losing their lives and the lives their loved ones. And I think this is like the highest level of bravery I can think of, like putting your life
totally,
just
totally.
to share an image or to tell a story. And I have to mention also that all of this, I mean, they were able to send the images despite the electricity blackout, the internet blackout, the shadow ban by the social media, most of them, and attacks which has been bought on all of those kind of platforms for providing balance, at least at the beginning, balance kind of account of all of the voices. We've seen like really an incredible job coming from those journalists, and we've seen also a younger generation of kids actually who inspired to those journalists and who started to think about like having their own channels and reporting about what's going on using their own language and reflecting in their own childhood, which was fascinating, to be honest. It gives me a lot of
Absolutely.
hope.
Absolutely. I mean, hats off to them for bringing the alternative truth to us and giving us the alternative to what's being fed to the audiences, to the consumers in the global north, especially the European countries or the North American countries. And at the same time, I mean, social media became more of a space which was giving this little bit of latitude to the people to bring out this alternative sort of like truth to the people. But ultimately, they also have scuttled the voices. For instance, the kind of things that happened to this live stream today is I wonder if we were running this directly on Instagram or Facebook or some other platform, would we even be able to live stream it, honestly? So these are the kind of things that are happening. But despite that, we know, thankfully, like there are people brave enough who are doing it on the ground and bringing us the realities. Mohammed, I realize, I mean, you have to leave and we are running out of time. So we'll come on to the last bit. The thing that I wanted to ask you is that ultimately we see so much happening, and the need of popular solidarities, the need for people to keep talking about these things is so very important. But at the same time, we did talk about democracy, popular protests that are happening in the global north. But when it comes to global south, there is a lot of repression that the people are facing. For instance, talk of South Asia, talk of African countries, people can't even protest, people can't even like raise the flags, people can't even talk about these things under such circumstance. And we are talking about the major chunk of world population who are not in a way allowed to express their solidarities or their concerns towards these things. I wonder, I mean, maybe many people who are watching today's session might even be scared to hit the like button on this or even react or put their comments just because they might get profiled. This is the level of repression that we are experiencing globally. So, under these situations, realizing how important solidarities remain, how do you think people express their solidarities, especially in the global south and environments? Maybe educational institutions, maybe businesses, maybe journalists, maybe individuals in their homes. Do you think there's a latitude or a bit of solidarity that each individual, each business, each newspaper they could do?
To be honest, I mean, first I would like to think that there is a lot of solidarity coming from the global south. Sometimes these kind of protests are not kind of underrepresented
Totally.
because we tend to think about Europe and what is happening in Europe and how this would affect the weapon industry, the arm industry, how this will change the things. Because I mean, people understand, and also the media outlets understand where the political weight is. But at the same time, I think this is, in a way, is counter productive because it makes many people in the global south feel that, okay, their voice and their empathy, their solidarity doesn't count, and provide kind of a form of invisibility of their voices, of their presence in the public spaces, that would encourage others to join and to show solidarity explicitly and in a clear form. So I think from the messages I've been receiving from people from all over the world showing support and solidarity and sharing prayers and thoughts with the situation, what is happening, I can see that lots of people are informed. Of course, there is a potential that those have a more political weight by mobilizing more and by basically find creative and new ways of showing protest. And this is where I think of like the BDS as one of the venues where they can practice this kind of protest, because it's about the consumer behavior, it's about what you eat, it's about what you shop, it's about how you do things, it's about your own lifestyle. And these kind of things are usually situated as something which is kind of private, so it doesn't really challenge the status quo in these kind of oppressive regimes. But this is just one idea about how these kind of communities can mobilize and can change things. The other thing, which I think is important, is it is very important that we organize other events like this one, for example, which speak to that audience and remind them of how much their voice is needed and is missing sometimes,
Totally.
and how much their voice have the potential of changing things, because we are speaking about the majority world. This is where most of the population of Earth exists, and they have the power.
Yeah.
It just you need to remind them that any form of injustice that they are enduring is connected to what is happening in Palestine, what is happening in other wars and other situations that we tend to tag as conflict. These are not conflicts. These are instances of long, decades of oppression and trying to maintain this kind of status quo, which work against the majority of the population living in the global south, despite having all the economic resources, all the supposedly like geopolitical weight. but these are kind of neutralized. So you need to, I think we need to
Totally.
engage more and more, first of all, with unions, with social movements, how small they are, but I think they are important, and they can be impactful
Yeah.
in changing things. But we need to connect all of these solidarity groups together and try to do something which is kind of a cross border, cross national, let's say. Uh,
Cross-national solidarities.
exactly. This I think is very important and had the potential. Probably some of this is more kind of, we have many examples in Latin America about these examples, but we need to expand on these kind of networks, especially in Asia and in Africa as well, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mohammed. Here, I would quickly go on to Hajar. I mean, what becomes also important is responsible media consumption, isn't it, for the local media houses and others and individuals? How do we engage with that?
And just a couple of examples to build on also Mohammed's answer about when we speak of solidarity, we should not be only limited to street protests. There is different forms, as Mohammed mentioned. We've seen in multiple cases that using art and entertainment to educate also and bring awareness is a good way to share information, to also amplify the voices. You mentioned the media aspect, amplifying the voices of Palestinians. So there is a lot of voices right now online. So it's a matter of amplifying them, not speaking on their behalf, but helping them to go to other platform that they might not be able to reach initially, and also the local media creating stories that humanize actually the Palestinians, because they have been vilified in so many other platforms. So it's important to actually give them the platform so they can express their standpoint. And I want to say, while I do also, when we create stories, there is always an editorial line. I think it's important, instead of going with a story in mind, to listen to Palestinian first and then come up with a story based on what you heard, instead of wanting a particular angle when you create that story. Again, so as a former journalist, I just wanted to give this couple of tips. But in terms of symbolic actions, there is a lot of symbolic actions. Of course, it's all about symbolism, but it means a lot also down the line. Renaming a street in honor of Palestinians that have given their lives in Gaza, local fundraising also by businesses. We see that. I don't know how feasible it is in African countries and in South Asia, but like you buy a cup of coffee and then one euros goes to fund this initiative. So there is always aspects of solidarity that don't need to happen necessarily in the streets.
Totally. As we are running out of time, one thing that you very importantly highlighted is fundraisers. Often, what's happening in the groups, we've highlighted a couple of them as well. There are appeals going on by people who are trying to say that they're doing interventions and bringing humanitarian relief to Gaza and raising hundreds of thousands of pounds. And while ultimately it's a hoax, for instance, the other day a person was actually called out where he said that they are providing relief in northern Gaza, whereas that's out of bounds. Nothing goes in there, and their claims couldn't even be verified. So one request to the people, that it's really important that all of us do our bit, but at the same time there is responsibility and like a significance of doing our due diligence as well. Just being emotional and throwing away money is not the way to go about it. Just verify the organizations and see whether that's they're actually doing the work on the ground. Just do not go by their words. Check the websites, check the other things, check the government records or registration documents. There are a lot of hoaxes also, phony people running around in WhatsApp group chats and personal pages and other places where they're asking for money. So please be aware of that. And I mean,
And,
yep,
if I may quickly add, and
yep,
Mohammed, please also, I would like your opinion on this. That's again, I don't want to favor the big organization and the big groups, but probably in these cases, to avoid the hoaxes, it's probably safer to rely on organizations that have had a history, that have had a presence in Gaza, because having a presence also means that you have a certain understanding of how to deal with the logistics inside of Gaza, how to deal with this, the security, even though it's not safe for anyone, even for the UN agencies that have been there for decades. But as you said, do your due diligence, do your homework in 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 finding out who you give your money to, and make sure that there is a history, there is a record of these organizations and what they've done. It doesn't need always to be the case in Gaza. It could be in Yemen and other places, but they need to be a some of a traceability of what they done in the past, because it's true. You've mentioned something that is very, very important. And sometimes, again, when there is a crisis, we don't take the time to think. We want to act quickly. We want to do things, and we end up giving to the wrong charity.
Totally. Yes, absolutely. And every bit counts. And one thing I would say towards the end is BDS is really important. That means many a times people that I speak to say that, all right, it's something that's happening in some, like these are the companies that operate in maybe the UK, the US, and others. It doesn't concern us. But these are the kind of products that reach our home, from our toothpaste to the kind of meals that we eat. So the responsible action of every individual can be just to verify if these are the companies that are contributing, and then indirectly our money is actually buying the bullets that are killing Palestinians or maybe oppressed people everywhere. So responsibly buying, being a responsible consumer of media, of goods and other things, is the basic essence of BDS. Read a little bit about it. If you need more information, please get in touch with us. And Muhammad and Hajar, thank you so very much for your time. Before we conclude, are there any concluding remarks quickly that both of you would like to say? First, starting from Hajar and then Muhammad.
Um,
Any concluding remarks?
Yes, I think we have discussed a lot, but there is definitely this can be a watershed moment. It can be a watershed moment of for a lot of changes, and it can go both ways, because we see a failure of abiding by the international system, and so we need to pause and we need to wonder how far can we go, and how much instability this will cause, not only to Gaza and the region, but to the entire world if we continue down that path. So there, I think it's a turning point for the humanity.
Absolutely. Muhammad.
I totally agree with Hajar. I think my final remark will be about the call for the ceasefire. We keep asking for the ceasefire, but I think I keep always reminding my friends and colleagues that it's not only about ceasefire. We need an end to an occupation that have been lasting for many decades now, and accountability. And without these, the same atrocities will be committed again and again and again, as we've seen in the last 20 years. Actually,
Totally.
Gaza has been subject to at least 6 different wars. Of course, the death toll wasn't that high as if this one, but the killing of Palestinians has become something which is normal. It's normalized. As long as we are the Palestinian die in silence, no one would care. Life will go on, and this is disheartening. And I think we need to put an end to all of this.
Totally.
And
Totally.
an end to this means an ending of the occupation. This is the source of all of these problems.
Absolutely.
And without that, I think we'll have so many conversations, and
Yeah.
so please do
Totally,
your
Muhammad.
bit. Think
Yeah.
about ways where you can mobilize your energy, mobilize your unions, your employers, show solidarity, and any form of symbolic, even solidarity, would be important, I think, in this kind of critical times. Thank you
Absolutely.
so much, Tawsif, for organizing this.
I mean, thanks to both of you. It was such a pleasure and delight having you. And me, inshallah, let's hope that we connect again, but on different issues, not on this one. Let us hope that this ends and we don't have to convene about this any further. And as you both very rightly say, ceasefire, but it doesn't end there. We have to ask for the end to occupation and colonization everywhere. And the least that we can do is educate ourselves, then educate others, and then think to ourselves the least that we can do, maybe being a good consumer, buying the products that are not contributing to these empires that are then ultimately occupying and killing people, or not reproducing things without thinking, but being critical in our consumption of the information that's coming to us. With that, and thank you so very much to the audiences that see us now or that'll see us in future. Thank you so very much. Keep raising awareness. Lots of du'as, Muhammad, for your family in Gaza. May Allah protect your family and every person in Gaza and everywhere where they're occupied. Thank you so very much, dear audiences. Assalamu alaikum. Bye.